This is day 4 of the September 90 7-day retreat at Springwater. I will read again some of the questions that I have remembered, which came up since yesterday's talk. How can one be with all the suffering in this world, in human beings, in animals, plants, earth, air and water, and not be totally crushed by it? Person was saying, particularly being in a privileged place like this. How does this all fit together? Being here in this beautiful place with so much care, and yet there being all the suffering in this world on so many different levels. Is the ego gone for you, Toni, all the time, or are you too in and out of it? Wasn't thought necessary to create this Springwater Center? A lot of questions about thought after we talked extensively and intensively about thought. Is suffering necessary for us to become kind and compassionate? Something disturbed me in your talk yesterday. You pointed out that thinking gets in the way of clear perception. And yet, isn't it very important to think clearly? Don't clear words and thoughts, like words of the poets, for instance, point us to something beyond the word? How to be with an intense pain in the heart. And another question about how to be with pain. Is that too meditation? Aren't we responsible for what we are thinking and doing? Referring to someone who had said that there was a realization that one was not responsible for all the thoughts going through the mind. There were several questions about that. Aren't we responsible? Don't we have responsibility for what we think and do, for our anger, for our angry thoughts? And another question, is there no place for thought and memory? Don't we need memory for being moral, kind? First, I'll say something about the hazards of giving a talk, which I entered in many times during the year and over the years. The hazard is the limitation of the word, the words, and the limitation of time. It's impossible ever to say everything. There's always something more that one could have said. And one could have anticipated better how what is being said can be misunderstood by the human brain, which thinks usually in black and white categories, in yes or no, right or wrong, should or shouldn't. We're not responsible for that. This is how we've been programmed. This brain has been programmed this way. And something is said about the interference of thought with clear perception, and the brain is very likely to pick this up as I shouldn't think in order to perceive clearly. It's bad or wrong. Something is said about memory impacting or distorting clear seeing, remembering what somebody did and therefore not seeing this person clearly, seeing him or her through the memory of what he said to me or what she did to me, and then the automatic assumption that memory is bad. We shouldn't have any memory. Not to think one is bad for having thought this way. It can go on and on and on, or it can be finished by a fresh listening, moving with what is being said and aware of what the brain does with it, alert to it, to the pitfalls of conclusions and assumptions that are made in this yes or no program, which is also, I understand, the program of computers. The principle in computers, yes or no, 1 or 2, or 1 or 0. I don't understand much about it. So, of course, memory is necessary. Couldn't have a talk, we couldn't listen. Without memory, couldn't speak a language, couldn't finish a sentence without remembering how the sentence started. And that is a very severe problem for people who have diseases of the brain or nervous system, where the memory is severely impaired. And then the interference with our proper functioning. There's a function in the brain that creates a body image. Someone from a retreat once sent me a book which many people of you may have read. It was a bestseller. It was called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It's done by a neurologist, written by a neurologist who relates very, one could almost say fascinating if it wasn't about suffering people, accounts of disturbance or injury to brain functioning. A woman who suddenly lost this ability to form a body image and could not coordinate anything anymore. She had to learn freshly due to tremendous capacity in this woman for willpower and intelligence to find entirely new clues to step out of bed or into a bus or to reach for something. And of course, to build this place, there had to be a tremendous amount of thinking and planning and visualizing. We knew we wanted this place, so those of us who were interested in it, and fortunately there were many people, got together. And I remember one of the first sessions we had with 2 architects was a kind of brainstorming where people just said things that they would like to see realized in a building, like light or indoor-outdoor correspondence, space, and so forth. And from this, the architects created an image, a picture. And as we went along, we thought, will this be right? And we didn't think the whole thing through completely either, or else we would have had a meeting room where you don't have to run a fan in order not to hear the people talk. And in this project, which were many people working together, it became very clear that if self began to dominate my position, my vision, my plans, my way of working, then we were in trouble. Because everybody has their vision, their way of working, their favorite thing that one becomes very identified with, and then battles for it. So we had lots of sessions to look at that too, so that the thinking could remain reasonably clear of these hindrances. When one goes back to work, there are lots of things one has to think about. If one runs a household, one has to think of what's going to be there for food and shop, make a list. Does one already make shopping lists now for when one gets back home? Using this generally, people report this, that as a retreat comes toward the end, the mind starts kicking in with all kinds of plans of what one has to do, how it will be. And that thinking blocks out the jay and the sound of the rain, doesn't it? We're not ever saying, even though it may sound this way and I may put it this way, inadvertently, we're not saying don't or you should. Don't think, shouldn't use memory. But can there be light shed on all of this? Can there be awareness of it? Because unless there is awareness in a human being of how this brain and body function from moment to moment, there's going to be deception. Self-deception and other deception. Not intentionally, but it operates that way. Without clarity, automatic programs run that may be not at all relevant to this moment, this encounter, this situation. They may or may not have been relevant in the past, or were already passed down without any particular relevance, other than that one has always thought this way and brought one's children up this way. Educated children in such and such a way. From this, the programs stem, apart from programs that are probably there at the time of birth, at the time of conception. ancient programs of, we mentioned yesterday or the day before, territorialism, rivalry, sexual rivalry. Greed at the food place, trying to keep others out, to get one's big share. So, unless there is some clarity at some moments in one's life, not all the time, of anyone who is aware or attentive all the time, and of course this includes myself, where do I have the raw material to talk from? Not just from what people tell me, but from what I look and discover in myself, in my moment-to-moment living, which is under the same programs and conditionings as everyone else. So unless there is this increasing awareness and clarity about how this mind works, there's going to be deception, because thought will appear as real, as reality, as truth. And it is not. It is a limited functioning of the brain, very useful, very helpful, particularly in our practical affairs, if it is clear and doesn't just come out of self-centeredness. If it comes out of self-centeredness completely, then it creates problems and conflict, maybe havoc, because we're attached in blindness, if there is no clarity, to what we do and say, and we defend it, fight for it, die for it, kill for it. I'm not accusing, it is so. I talk with people a lot who have been left by their lover, who has taken another lover. Maybe everyone here knows something from one's own experience. And the thoughts that come up have the whole of violence and murderousness that some people express directly. Others just think about it. But it is there in all of us. Tremendous anger and violence when someone who one thought was mine is now someone else's. One person, the way he put it was, I'm not going to make it easy. My former lover wants to make up with me. I'm not going to make it easy. But by talking about it, looking at the toxicity of these thoughts, and coming in direct contact with the toxicity of it, poisoning our whole system, there can be insight by direct contact. Maybe at first just talking about it superficially, on the verbal level. And then maybe stopping to think some more for oneself and look directly. Maybe directly see the unintelligence of such deeply conditioned thinking and potential acting. And in that there can be a dropping away, because something has been understood directly in oneself through clear looking and clear thinking. They go hand in hand, but clear thinking needs clear looking. If it's just based on assumption and premises which have not been tested by oneself, how can it be clear? Then it becomes belief and dogma, albeit quite logical, as many religious systems are very logical in themselves, or theological or philosophical systems. They have an inherent logic but the logic is based on unproven assumptions or untested assumptions. About the beauty of words of a poet. A poet may see clearly and have the capacity to put that into words and stir something within us. That same clarity? Or are the words based on idea and fantasy? May not make them any less beautiful, but then they're not clear. They don't point to something clear and factual and actual, but just stimulate the fantasy. We're sort of at a fork. We could go into taking responsibility or the suffering of the world. And they will come together again. It probably doesn't matter which way we go. We'll stay with the suffering, because we talked about the immense suffering of jealousy in oneself and the consequences of one's jealous thoughts and actions on others, the effect on others. Families pitted against each other. Non-forgotten grudges pitting families, tribes, clans, nations against each other, capable of evoking anything. We human beings kill each other for ideas, for emotions, which are nurtured, aroused and nurtured by thought and image. Acquisitiveness, wanting to possess, to own, to keep, not let someone else have it. Get more, plunder. This is what wars have been about too, since time immemorial. To get booty and bounty. One has to first imagine that one would have that, and then go for it. Have more land, more slaves, more women. And this suffering of the victim as well as the victor, because eventually revenge catches up. This suffering has been going on for thousands of years. And is still going on in new guises, and yet it's the same thing. The same thing that can be, maybe if there is interest and honesty and clarity, the roots of that can be observed in oneself. The potential for it. Because this is what the world is made up of, is human beings like you and me. In relationship, or rather, the difficulty or inability of relating to each other clearly, kindly, compassionately. And you and I don't discover these roots, the roots of anger, of jealousy. Which starts with seemingly superficial questions. But if we don't trace it down to the root and discover it for ourselves, this unconscious consciousness, this automatic way of continuing with ancient patterns of hurt, violence, revenge, acquisition, continues. So is that the relationship between being here and the immense suffering going on in the world? Due to acquisitiveness, power, might, violence, jealousy, unburied grudges. Is this the connection to see here in one seemingly insignificant human being what is going on in the world by seeing it in oneself with clarity, not with sentimentality or guilt? Because if we're sentimental or guilty, we can't look. The perception is clouded. Sometimes people say, why do you talk so much about negative things in human beings? Why don't you say something nice? The real nice things that happen, the good things that human beings do, speak for themselves. They don't need a spokesperson. And I'm not a spokesperson for the negative things. I just feel passionately that we need to see this and understand it in ourselves, to be clear of it, at least for moments at a time, so that someplace in this human consciousness, which is not a divided affair, yours and mine, we all partake in that, we all participate in it, we all manifest it, so that someplace in this human consciousness there is some insight taking place, someone coming off of autopilot, as one person put it. I feel I'm on autopilot all the time. And autopilot immediately equates with sorrow, conflict. Because it's not the direct in touchness with a live situation, with a live response, which comes out of seeing, being there, not out of automatic, habitual ideas of how I should behave and be moral. Memory does provide precepts for behaving moral, but we transgress our precepts all the time. We feel better because we mouth them and vow them and pledge them, and then we're going on with the same patterns unless there's some insight and clarity. And when there is insight and clarity, we don't need precepts. It's clear what to do and what not to do. This is how we come to the other question. Aren't I responsible for my thoughts, for what I'm doing? It sounds really monstrous. to say, I'm not responsible for my angry thoughts. Some people have felt that. Who is this person kidding? But it wasn't meant, I will from now on act irresponsibly. This is what this yes-no brain does. If someone says, I'm not responsible, it must mean irresponsibility. But it's not what that means to see that there's no one separate from these thoughts and that they come flowing as automatically as who knows what. Out of conditioned patterns that make me angry. I was not given the right treatment. I was crossed. I was cheated and so forth. And then the anger. Automatic reaction. And then saying, I shouldn't be angry. I'm bad for having these angry thoughts. I should control them. I should take responsibility for them and do penitence for them. And so we go on and on and on in patterns. Unless there's insight, that there is no I separate from the stream of thoughts. That the I itself is part of the stream of thoughts. And to see that brings some clarity into this confused division from which we all suffer. Trying to get better, trying to be moral, and transgressing, and repenting, and feeling guilty. And you know what happens when we feel guilty? Then we look for blame in others. It's so automatic. Because it's too hard to bear this guilt oneself. So if one can find something wrong with someone else, then it's easier to bear for some amazing reason. And this is how we malign each other so easily. One person found that out, said, I compare myself all the time with people here. And I compare unfavorably to others who seem to be so much more proficient in this sitting meditation. And then I find that I don't like these other people. That I become hostile toward them. One begins to project things onto these other people with whom one initially feels one compares unfavorably. And then this person said, I find this is how the distance is created between me and these other people. This is looking and having insight into what happens with this mind. So, to discover where the anger comes from, the angry thoughts, and how the angry thoughts stoke this anger. The root of it is me. I was not treated fairly, justly. Why doesn't she see how much I do for her? Why doesn't she feel grateful for it, rather than bitching at me? And the anger about unfairness done to me. Where there's anger, there's always a me that has been hurt, treated unfairly, not respected. And with that, the enclosure, the blindness toward the other person. The lack of space to find out about that other person. It's not there in the anger. I'm talking so much about anger because it is such a overriding problem for human beings, having such poisonous consequences, as this person realized, I'm poisoning myself with all of that. How unintelligent. So, if this inner division, this inner conflict between me who should be better, me who is bad, me who this and that, if that drops in the insight of how thoughts proceed so automatically, so beyond control, and as a relief from this whole guilt trip and trip to become better, and maybe some space to see what is going on now. Space. And in this space of no inner division, it's possible to respond intelligently to a new situation, not from old patterns, but from looking now. This is really what responsibility is in its deepest sense, to respond freshly and clearly out of looking now. There are these numerous stories people tell about, particularly when I was in California this spring, about people jumping into aid during this earthquake with no sense for saving or protecting their own life. Sometimes a tremendous shock just knocks the whole thought structure out of the mind. And there's clarity to see what needs to be done and the energy to do it. Because the thought structure about me and my precepts and what I should do binds and ties up the energy. And that energy is released to look and act. The looking and acting not being two separate affairs. Or people telling about jumping into a lake to save a drowning person. No intention to do good. It's just, there it is, and there one is. Finds oneself pulling out this drowning person. That is being responsible, not out of ethical or moral ideas, but out of the clarity of the moment and the energy that clarity brings. To see and act rightly. Coming back to the question, we haven't answered that, and I don't know if there is an answer. Whether one can be with and understand the suffering of this world on many levels without being totally crushed by it. Is it possible? Very often it proceeds this way, going into one's own suffering and sorrow, investigating it, finding out about it, wondering who is the sufferer. Again, this division that we carry around between me, the sufferer, and what I am suffering, and the pain of that, the darkness of it. And as we have gone through in every talk, we don't have to do it so intensely this time, just being that sorrow, not as a separate sufferer, just that. Unconditionally there, because it's there. And very often, then one realizes it's not just my personal suffering or sorrow that I'm contacting or that there is contact with, but it is universal sorrow of human beings. And not to avoid that contact when it presents itself, when it arises. The awareness of that. Universal suffering or sorrow. Sorrow is better because suffering, there is this sufferer. Maybe without the sufferer, would there be sorrow? Sorrow of losing family, child, loved ones in an accident, an earthquake, famine, war. There is that sorrow, isn't there? It's been with us. And in not shunning it, not escaping from it, and not wallowing in it, not becoming the sufferer, and then being the sufferer becomes much more important to one than in touch with the sorrow. And it has diverted into this me structure, being somebody. And a lot of us wallow in being sufferers or victims, martyrs. Can that be seen and drop? So there's just touch with pure sorrow. Is that where compassion arises for human beings? Out of this touch, this contact, without being the crushed sufferer, the understanding of it in depth by understanding sorrow in oneself, suffering in oneself. Is that where compassion arises? A compassion which is not sentiment. It has a depth to it. And an action. Which doesn't come from the me. Can one question all that, look at it deeply alone and together maybe? People getting together and discussing, maybe starting with the superficial but going deeper. Not from a position, but from not knowing. Starting with not knowing the answer. We will end here for today.